Right, hello guys, Luton here, welcome back for another video, and today I'm going to be looking again at my Ultramarines army and I'm giving you guys an update. As I said before, this will be an ongoing process of updating. Last time I was showing for you guys basically where I am right now with the army, the current status of the painting and so on. I was really interested in some of your comments and I was surprised by how many people thought that I should just do nothing and leave everything as it is, especially from a nostalgic point of view to just look back at the models, and I agree that there's definitely some of them where that can be the case. I can think of a few just off the top of my head that I would love to keep as they are and not do anything to them, so I can look back and remember, hey, you know, this is where I was at when I was like 10 years old or whatever. With that said though, I definitely want to push my painting forward, and there's some models, like I say, that I look back at and I think, you know, I really want to see that one updated. With regards to the updating, I have done some tests, you know, even with just a little bit of cleaning up myself, just a little bit of pin washing and shading, some small detailing and so on and so on, you can salvage a lot of stuff. And so I really don't think, given your comments as well, that I need to go back and do full repaints on a lot of the models. But I do think that what I'll try to do is squad by squad go in and look at some of those details. Now, again, some of the guys like on that left hand side that we looked at before, I think I might even kind of keep these guys because yeah, they are kind of like a nice little blast to the past. The second stage ones that we looked at, those are the ones that I'm probably going to do some pin shade, washing and detailing. The other ones, the third stage, they're probably on the back burner, you know, they're good enough for now, like I said. And then the fourth guy is the one, of course, that I did recently. But what I want to show for you today is what I have been working on for the past kind of week. I've been doing some writing and other stuff as well, but this is Dreadnought Crassus. This was an eBay buy that I bought for about £5 or something. It was basically painted badly, it needed completely stripping, which I did using BioStrip, and I know you guys have asked me to do a video about how to strip miniatures. Now, as I've said before, I actually have a video for that on the channel already, but that was just using the Dettol method. Now, there are loads of different methods, and you guys always say in the comments, oh, you can do this, you can do that. Yep, I know, we all know the methods by now, it's pretty straightforward stuff, but the real thing when it comes to stripping miniatures is how to do it, okay? And yes, you can use kind of like sonic machines or whatever to do that, but I actually think the best way to do it is still manually yourself. It's not very difficult to do, and I'll look at that very soon. Now here today in this video, I don't have many actual video clips of the process because it's a bit of a pain in the ass to set up the camera and everything and have it there whilst you're doing the work. But what I will do is talk you through everything, and soon I will be making a video where I look at a comprehensive beginner's guide on kind of the things, the tools that you need. I'll try and make some kind of list of items and so on and so on. And I'm no pro painter by any means, but what I will do is talk you through the kind of things that I have learned over the years and the details and the bits and pieces that you need to think about and do as you're kind of getting into it to basically move forward as quickly as possible and get some good results. This was using BioStrip. You basically put it in a pot, put the BioStrip in there with it, turn it over, get it all covered, and then you can take it out, you can get some water onto it, scrub that off, pick it off with some little dental picks or something like this, and then the results you get you can see here for yourself. It actually removes this very, very cleanly, and providing whoever originally did a model didn't damage it badly, you're going to get it back to essentially the original production quality. Now this one had a lot of super glue and water soluble glue, and this is something I'll talk about on my beginners video, but essentially there's a couple of different glues that you can use when putting models together. The obvious one being super glue, but you can also use liquid cement glue. Now the difference is that with super glue, it will basically put a liquid there which is going to hold the pieces together. But when you break it apart, they can usually snap off fairly cleanly. But if you use liquid cement, it doesn't bind as quickly as super glue. But what it does do is it is literally sort of fusing those two pieces of plastic together. And that means that later, if you buy a model which has had a lot of liquid cement glue put onto it, you can have a very difficult time getting those pieces off because essentially they've been made into one piece of plastic. And you can even damage the model. You have to be very careful. So if it doesn't break off immediately, if you're trying to take apart a model, it's probably had liquid cement glue put onto it, and you need to either cut it or very, very carefully apply pressure to specific points so you don't end up damaging and breaking that model when you take it apart, which is something I have done before because you will literally bend and tear the plastic apart rather than break that glue. That's how hard of a bond it is. So then once we got everything nice and clean, what I needed to do was think, okay, what am I going to do with this model to make it interesting? I decided that I wanted this to be a more interesting model than just a standard Dreadnought, which is why it took me a week to put together instead of a couple of days. And something I'd seen around online for a while was sometimes on knights and so on, people can kind of cover the shoulder pauldrons with skulls. Now you can buy these skulls on big resin sheets and then you can break them off yourself. Now some of them come kind of individually, but this was actually on a sheet where they're kind of all embedded together. So what I had to do to get these off and mount them on this shoulder here was to cut them from that backing plate, which was no easy task. It was actually very challenging to align, and what I used to achieve that was one of these Tamiya miniature saws. This is a really good piece of kit. You can get them from Amazon. It's very, very sharp and it cleanly cuts through the resin very, very easily. I could just hand hold it and saw through this stuff. It really tears through, and you can get very, very fine detailing, which is going to enable you to basically carve up anything you need. I used this later on for the end of the model as well on the base to cut to pieces a old Khorne Marine that I wanted to use as a slaughtered Marine on the battlefield for the basing. Then next up I wanted to add some custom elements to the model. I also wanted the Dreadnought to be an exposed Marine instead of encased in the sarcophagus, because I wanted this to be like a special character. Now here I was making some purity seals and scrolls and other things using green stuff. Green stuff is like a putty that you can buy from Games Workshop. You can buy some other stuff as well from Amazon, which is basically the same in just bigger quantities, and they have some slightly different properties. You can mold and roll this and carve this into whatever you want to. This is just using a roller here to achieve the piping effect. Then afterwards just spray paint it black and we're good to go. So that's basically some of the little other details that you'll see in the finished model that I custom made myself to go on here. So now we'll talk about the painting. So this is very roughly my painting setup here. You can see I've got a range of different paints here, from Citadel stuff to Vallejo model paint as well. I use a couple of different paints these days, and I don't just stick to the Citadel stuff. This is something I learned from my Siege Studios course, that there are other paints out there and that you should actually try them out, because most of my paints for the actual Ultramarines model itself, in terms of what I'm going to use for the army, are not Citadel now. I still use Citadel for a lot of stuff, but I was very happy to find the colours that you can get out of some of these other ranges, and it's very much worth experimenting, especially with maybe your core colours for an army, to see if you can achieve something that's more to your liking before you go ahead and paint an entire army. Just buy a couple of paints, see if those ones work better for you. Now again, I will do this in my whole breakdown video, but essentially around the workspace you're going to need some blue tack for sticking your models on, some bases, yogurt pots to hold the models on. You've got all the paints over there. Right hand side you've got the brushes. There's a wet palette off screen, which I'll show you in a second. I've got some other bits and pieces, some sponges, some little files and picks and a scalpel and stuff like that to carve and cut things with. Like I said, I'll give you a proper breakdown when I do this comprehensive vid soon, and we'll talk about the brushes, we'll talk about all the different tools, what they're useful for, what are the best ones, what you should try and use, what you can get away with, and all this kind of stuff. Now when it comes to painting, I do tend to gravitate towards a wet palette these days. I didn't before, but now that I've kind of relearned a lot of stuff, it's actually the go-to thing to do. Now there does always seem to be this kind of fear of a wet palette, that it's some big and complicated thing, and it really isn't. Essentially all it is a piece of kitchen roll that you wet and place under a piece of baking parchment to keep your paint wet for longer so that it doesn't just dry out. That's basically it. It's not some big scary thing. It's also not at all worth buying a wet palette, because all you're essentially buying is a little plastic box. There's no big science thing to this. You 100% do not need to buy a wet palette, okay? I don't say this for many things, because I usually say, oh, you know, you should just use what you want, and, you know, if it works for you, then great. But this is one thing that I will be a bit of a stickler about now and in the future. Do not buy a wet palette. Do not spend money on a wet palette. Just go and buy a standard piece of Tupperware, you know, plastic sealed tub, okay? Just put a piece of kitchen roll and some parchment on it. That's all you need. But I have seen and handled several produced wet palettes at this point, and it's just a plastic box, and a shit plastic box at that. Do not spend money on a wet palette. It is literally pissing your money away. And I don't say that often, because like I say, I like people to kind of just choose their own things, and if it works for them, then great. But this is the one thing. Wet palette. Do not buy, okay? Do not buy. Just get a plastic tub from your supermarket. That is all you need. So the next thing to mention is, yes, I do use an airbrush for models. I don't want to get into really talking about airbrushes in a big way today, because otherwise it's going to go on and on. But I use an Iwata Neo. It's just a pretty standard airbrush, nothing very expensive, but it's decent quality, it's good, it does the job. The compressor I use though is more expensive. That is a Sparmax TC 620 X. It's a twin piston compressor. I got this pretty recently off of a recommendation actually from Siege Studios, James at Siege Studios, because I wanted to know what compressor would be a good one to get, and this was one of the options I decided to go with. Now, it was a more expensive price point, but honestly I think it's been worth it already. Because it's a twin piston, the air tank gets refilled very quickly. It's actually pretty quiet as well for a compressor, and then because it's that twin piston, it means it refills so fast that you barely have the compressor on for any length of time at all. So it was a very good buy. The one thing I will say when it comes to airbrushing though is that you're going to want a space to airbrush in that's going to help contain the spray, because it's going to go everywhere. What I use here, this is actually just some cereal boxes I cut up and made into like a little unit that I can spray into. When I come to base coat stuff with a rattle can, I do that outside, so the ventilation and so on. But for airbrush inside, you're going to need some other equipment to help protect you. Now, some people will have a proper cabinet, which is like got an extraction, all the rest of it. For most people, that's not really practical. So what I use is just some of these little builder's masks. You can pick them up at a hardware shop, a few for a pack, not very expensive, and they do the job fine. Yes, if you want to spend out, you can get a proper respirator with detachable filters and all the rest of it if you want to, but if you don't think it's worth it, look at this. This is just from me painting these last few models, and that blue there, you can see the blue is behind the mesh, so that isn't paint which has bounced back onto the mask. That's paint which I have tried to breathe in and the mask has stopped it. So that gives you an idea of how much you could be breathing in if you don't wear a mask when you're using an airbrush. So you really need to get that. I also have some goggles as well, which is useful for when I'm stripping models using any solvents. You don't want to flick any of that in your eyes, which can happen if you've got paint brushes and stuff like that around. And also it's good again for airbrushing, especially when I'm using varnish. Okay, so then we come to the paintings. So what do I use for painting my models? Now, of course, this is ultramarine, so you're going to use your own colors for your guys. What I use to prime the model in terms of base coat is just the Games Workshop black spray can. You can buy these from Games Workshop, and they cover really well, actually. They're pretty good. I was not sure about rattle cans until I tried this, because I think when they first came out when I was a kid, I think I did a really shit job, and it kind of soured me to it. But actually, they cover well, and they're the easiest, quickest way to do it. So then the colors I use for my ultramarines that I have decided on, like I say, I've tested out a few different recipes. What I'm using is a base color of a P3 Signar blue base. This will be listed below. The base highlight I use is a Vallejo ultramarine blue, and then the general layer color is the Vallejo magic blue. Then I highlight also with Vallejo electric blue. So let me come on to more of the details. I can probably rattle through this a little bit quicker now. So once I've got that blue on there, I've done a little bit of pin shading, and I'm going to go in and start painting some of these details with the golds. The yellow there is for the hazard line stripes, which I will do, and hazard lines are a massive nightmare for me. I have always hated doing hazard lines. Basically, the only thing that you need to know is that it just takes a lot of time and a lot of patience and a lot of brush control and hand control to do this. You just need to be patient and practice and practice. That's the only thing which you can do. I have always found it very difficult to do, and that is all you need to do. I've also got the transfers on there, started putting the model together, started filling in some of the blacks, some of the metallics, and so on and so on. The next thing I wanted to get out of the way was painting the head for the model. This is one of the Sterngard ultramarine heads that I just have used to kit bash into the model. And I think honestly I have improved my head painting very significantly. And a lot of that comes from the Siege Studios course. The notes and so on that I took from the Siege Studios course were really helpful. For example, painting of the eyes, how to do the shading on the heads, all this kind of stuff. Like I've mentioned on a couple of other videos, that was a game changer of a course for me, and it's really propelled me and made me feel, like I said, sort of inspired and driven to kind of really push myself in terms of what I can achieve. So then once that's ready, I moved on to adding some more detailing, which is basically just weathering onto the gold. For this, I just used some of the Typhus Corrosion and some of the Mr. Hobby weathering that I've been trying out as well. That's like a solvent-based ink. Also for my bits box, added a little resistor here to the back of the assault cannon, because I think it just adds a bit more character and kind of fills it out a little bit right there. Also started to color in the power plant and so on. Here on the hazard lines, you can see I've added a highlight all the way through that hazard line, and I added a bit of sort of tonal coloration in there as well. So next we have the skull painting, and for pretty much any skulls, any bone, what you're going to want to start off with is some kind of standard darkish brown. Then you're going to move up to a slightly lighter brown, a slightly more paler thing after that. Then maybe put some kind of Agrax earth wash over it, or any kind of like dullish brown wash. Then you're going to go in with a lighter color and then another lighter color to highlight after that, and that will give you a good finish for your skulls. In between the final paler colors, if you wanted to add some kind of pin shading washes or a very pale wash to kind of sit within some of the recesses on the skulls, you could do that, and it will help to bring some tonal detail to the skulls in the end. So this is kind of like the mid-level stage, and you can see what we've got is a bit of weathering in here, a lot of shading, the base colors are in there, the highlights and the details are in there. Now I still need to go in and do lots of the other fine details, but if this was a more standard model that I wasn't really going to push forward in a big way, what I would do here is just highlight it, do a tiny little bit of weathering on, and that's it, done, you know, just varnish it. But because this was a model I wanted to push myself a little bit further, you can see I'll go in and we add these other details now. For example, the two scrolls here, the one on the left I actually made myself out of green stuff, the one on the right comes with the model, and again I've just gone in there with a very fine highlighting brush and just painted that text and the Aquila on the top there. So after I painted up those details and some of the other things like the purity seals, etc, we come on to the fun stage of highlighting, and highlighting is always a pain because it's very fine work and it can be very tricky. Now this model also, I've added a twin-linked las cannon because I had a spare one knocking around, so I decided to add that as well. So this guy has got the assault cannon or twin-linked las cannon option that I can switch out. So you can see the lens, for example, on the twin-linked las cannon, and again I painted that using a technique from Siege Studios and pretty happy with the result that I got for that. You can see on the power fist to the right he has some kind of metal bolt inside of the power fist, and what I decided with this character is that he would have something akin to the cerebral bore from Turok. If you know Turok the game, the cerebral bore was an alien weapon which you could basically fire the bore, which is, imagine like a servo skull with a drill attached, and then it flies off, grabs hold of the enemy's head and then just drills into them until their head explodes. I think that's actually kind of some kind of weapon I might kind of come up with that I might sort of customize for my own units. If you imagine like a swarm of servo skulls but with like kind of claws on, just drill them until they blow up. So yeah, I had this idea that with the power fist for real tough enemies he could grab hold of them, not just crush them but also drill into them. So then we come to the basing, and the basing, again, I've made a pain for myself. It took way longer than it should have done, and that's mainly because of the name. I wanted the name of the character, the Dreadnought, on the model, so it's Crassus. And what I did was I took a little resin block like you get from Forge World when you snip off and you have these little resin blocks left over, and what I did was I carved the name into it using a file and a scalpel. It was not easy, it took me a long time to do. I've also then added just with some PVA glue, and I've got a little box of sharp grit sand which you can use for basing models. You can see here on the rear of the power plant I've added a small heat bloom. Again, I don't like to go overboard. Sometimes I see heat blooms and they're like really strong blue and orange and red. I don't think that looks good, and often people do it very consistently on the model, and I think you want to kind of be a bit inconsistent with that, so I don't really like heat bloom like that. I also like my models to look a little bit dirty because I like them to look worn and weathered and like they've actually been in battle, so they've got some weathering. But I've also added, you can see on the rear here, a lot of kind of smoke and soot and dirt, which you can imagine would come from a very filthy power plant burning on the back of this thing. Now, top tip for basing, I'll probably do this in another video separately again. When you've got some sand or grit on your model, what you're going to want to do is get some PVA glue, water it down very thin, maybe sort of 3 or 4 to 1, and then you're going to want to place this, just let it sit into the gravel and the sand. Because if you don't do that, it's just going to fall off, or it's going to stick to your paintbrush when you come to paint it. So you want to fill that in pretty heavily. Because it's PVA glue, it will dry clear, and often it will just sort of evaporate away as it dries as well. But it's going to hold all that sand and grit together so it stays on the base and it doesn't come off all over the brush or just fall off the model. And then you would think that we were all but done, but then I decided, you know what, actually I think this needed something else. It needed something else to the base to really add and bring it to life and bring some character to the model. So what I did was I found an old easy build Khorne Berserker that I had from the 90s. So what I did was basically I cut him in half, took his shoulder off, broke his hand apart, and basically devastated him. And then I've just saturated the base and the model with some blood medium, which is basically like a glistening blood. And again, that looks really good on the nameplate for the model as well, the fact that it's sprayed all over it. And that is basically it. This is Dreadnought Crassus, and I was very pleased with this model. I think it's about as good as I can do right now, but if I really wanted to push myself, there's some other details and things that I could add in here, but for this one and for this amount of time that I was spending on it, this was good enough. But you know, I think as I go along, I'm not going to spend as long as I did on this guy for all of the models for sure, especially some of the stock troops and stuff like this. One of the things that really bogged me down in terms of time for this guy was doing some of the conversion elements, carving stuff out, building the things in green stuff, all these things. So, you know, like I say, it took me about a week to do this. If I, for example, had not decided to do those pain in the ass hazard lines on the cable which goes over the model, that would have saved me massive amounts of time. If I decided not to make a kind of custom base element, that would have saved me a lot of time. So, you know, I think I can bash out some of these things much faster. But just for comparison's sake, look at the Dreadnought that I did previously and look at this one now. And this is the old Dreadnought that I did back in the day as a kid, and you can see, like, it's okay, but the blue paint that's on here is very, very thick indeed. I also think I savaged this guy with a compass or something. I remember scratching and bullet holing this guy all over the place. But you know, it's funny, coming back to some of these old models, they're sometimes not as bad as you think. And the paint is thick on this guy, and some of it is a bit absurd. But you know, I almost don't know if I want to strip this guy down. I think I could go in and add some little details and things like this. And you know, maybe I could pull off that camo netting, I don't know. Or on the left hand side here where the wolf pelt is, doesn't make sense for an Ultramarine Dreadnought, you know, but I could cover that over. But it's kind of fun to come back and look at some of these things and be like, yeah, you know what, it's actually not so bad when you put it up against the other one that I've got right there. But you know, nonetheless, it's nice to see the progression and see how we've gone from something like this, which I did when I was about 12, 13 years old, I can't even remember now. If we're going to compare older models to where we are now, look at this guy. This is a Terminator which I painted way back in the day. And again, pretty much the same as the Dreadnought. The paint on there is pretty thick. The details, not the best. But then compare this to the model which I just painted this week as well. This was a Terminator that I painted alongside the Dreadnought this week. And again, I really wanted to try and get this to as good as I could do. And I think with this guy, there's a few little bits and pieces I could have just done slightly better. But this was probably, I would say, the best Terminator that I have ever painted. And it feels very, very good to kind of see that. Some things which really triggered me were, for example, the badly painted hazard lines, the Crux Terminatus that I could never get clean. And so to see this now makes me actually feel pretty happy. And I just thought I would showcase this guy as well. This is another model I painted very recently. This is a Legion Praetor. It's a Heresy era period model, but again, it can, you know, can use it whatever for my liking anyway. But it's a Forge World model, and it's the first time I ever really tried to do anything like a non-metallic effect, and yeah, it was okay. It didn't work out too great, but I was very, very pleased with how this model turned out nonetheless. I think it looks epic, just a really, really cool model, and again, regardless whether I ever use it in a game, it's just a really awesome model to own, and it's going to look fantastic in the army as just a kind of standard HQ or some kind of leadership model to go in there. So that's basically it for this video, guys. That's a little update on what I have been doing. Like I say, this model was really something that I kind of wanted to just sort of push myself and get back into thinking about conversions and all other things like this. But you know, like I said, I've got those other models I want to go back through and highlight and improve and just do some little, you know, finessing on to bring the army kind of up to speed, as well as getting into doing some of the new models, the Primaris and other stuff like this. But you know, I wanted to get this out there as kind of point one of an updating series, which I hope will roll on. I hope this has been interesting for you. And like I say, I want to do some other bits and pieces like terrain, paint stripping, talking about how to paint miniatures and other stuff like this. Of course, it will just bleed into the other content, but I hope this will be interesting, even if you don't paint miniatures, to just have a look at the models and just think, yeah, okay, I can kind of appreciate this or see where this is going, or that's interesting to look at. So tell me what you think down below as always, and I'll have some new stuff coming up very soon. Thanks again for watching, guys. I will see you next time.